The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day. The crisp London air carried the familiar sounds of tourists gathering beyond the palace gates, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony that had remained unchanged for centuries. James had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 8 years, and the weight of tradition sat heavily on his shoulders every single day. The rules were carved in stone: no speaking, no moving, no acknowledgement of the outside world. These weren't just guidelines. They were sacred protocols that had been followed by generations of guards before him. Breaking them meant immediate dismissal, disgrace, and the end of a military career he had worked his entire adult life to build. At 29, James understood the honor of his position better than most. His grandfather had served in the same regiment during World War II, and his father had been a palace guard in the 1980s. The Morrison family had military blood running through their veins, and James carried that legacy with fierce pride. Every morning when he put on the iconic bearskin hat and picked up his rifle, he felt connected to something greater than himself. The tourists began to gather earlier than usual that Tuesday morning in September. James could hear the excited chatter of children and the clicking of cameras as families positioned themselves for the best view of the ceremony. This was his favorite part of the job, knowing that people traveled from around the world just to witness this piece of living history. Even though he couldn't acknowledge them directly, he felt their excitement and wonder. As James took his position at the palace entrance, he noticed the crowd was particularly dense today. A school group from Manchester had arrived, along with what appeared to be several tour buses filled with international visitors. The energy was electric, and James could feel the anticipation building as the ceremony time approached. Standing at attention, his rifle held firmly at his side, James began the mental routine that helped him maintain his composure during the long periods of stillness. He would count his breaths, recite poetry his mother had taught him as a child, and sometimes mentally write letters to his younger sister who was studying at university. These small mental exercises helped the time pass and kept his mind sharp, despite the physical demands of remaining motionless for hours. The palace courtyard had seen countless ceremonies, royal arrivals, and historic moments. James often thought about the guards who had stood in his exact spot during wartime, during royal weddings, during times of national celebration and mourning. He was part of an unbroken chain of service that stretched back centuries, and that knowledge filled him with both pride and responsibility. As the morning progressed, James noticed movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. A small commotion seemed to be developing near the main gate, but protocol demanded he keep his eyes fixed straight ahead. The sounds of the crowd were changing too. The cheerful tourist chatter was mixing with something else, voices that carried a different tone. There was urgency in the air, but James remained perfectly still, trusting that whatever was happening would be handled by the appropriate personnel. The weight of his bearskin hat pressed down on his forehead, a constant reminder of the solemnity of his duty. The red wool of his tunic absorbed the growing warmth of the morning sun, but James had long ago learned to ignore physical discomfort. Temperature, fatigue, even hunger were simply obstacles to overcome in service of the crown and country. Little did James know that in just a few minutes, he would face the most difficult decision of his military career, a choice that would force him to weigh a lifetime of training and tradition against something far more powerful: the call of human compassion and the debt owed to those who had sacrificed everything for their country. Their ceremony was about to begin, and James Morrison was about to discover that sometimes the most important moments in life come not from following the rules, but from knowing when to break them. The commotion at the palace gates was growing louder, and James could now make out individual voices cutting through the general buzz of the crowd. There was concern in those voices mixed with what sounded like gentle encouragement. His training told him to ignore it completely, but something deeper was pulling at his attention. Through the corner of his eye, James caught sight of a small group making their way slowly through the crowd. At the center was an elderly man moving with great difficulty, supported by what appeared to be family members. The man was wearing a military uniform, not a costume or replica, but a genuine dress uniform that had clearly seen many years of careful preservation. Multiple service medals caught the morning light as they swayed gently with each labored step. The elderly veteran was moving toward the palace with determined purpose, despite obvious physical limitations. His left leg appeared to be prosthetic and his right arm hung motionless at his side. Each step required tremendous effort, but there was something in his posture that spoke of unwavering resolve. This was a man who had made difficult journeys before and wasn't about to be stopped by this one. James felt his heart rate increase slightly as he watched the scene unfold. The veteran's family members, a middle-aged woman who was likely his daughter and a younger man who could have been his grandson, were providing gentle support without taking away the man's dignity. They understood that this journey was something he needed to complete on his own terms. The crowd around the veteran began to notice what was happening. Tourists who had been focused on taking selfies and chatting about their travel plans gradually fell silent as they realized they were witnessing something significant. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view, not of the palace or the guards, but of this remarkable man who was creating his own moment of ceremony. As the veteran drew closer, James could see more details of his uniform and medals. There was a Distinguished Service Cross, a Purple Heart, and several campaign ribbons that spoke of service in multiple conflicts. This wasn't just any veteran. This was a man who had given everything for his country and bore the physical and emotional scars to prove it. The veteran's breathing was labored, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His family members whispered quiet words of encouragement, but James could see the man's determination wavering slightly. The distance to the palace entrance, which would be nothing to a healthy person, was becoming a marathon for someone with his limitations. Other members of the crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. A spontaneous hush fell over the area, as people instinctively created a path for the veteran's approach. Cameras that had been focused on the guards and the palace architecture slowly turned toward this unfolding human drama. This wasn't the ceremony anyone had come to see, but it was becoming something far more powerful. James found himself in an impossible position. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to remain motionless, to maintain the stoic dignity that was the hallmark of the Queen's Guard, but another part of him, the part that understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice, was responding to something deeper than protocol. The veteran stumbled slightly, catching himself with obvious pain. His daughter reached out to steady him, but he gently waved her away, determined to complete this journey under his own power. The crowd held its collective breath as the man gathered himself and continued forward, step by agonizing step. James could see the man's destination now. The veteran wasn't just randomly approaching the palace. He was heading directly toward James's position. There was purpose in his movements, a specific goal that was driving him forward despite the obvious physical cost. This wasn't a tourist's casual visit to a famous landmark. This was a pilgrimage. The morning sun climbed higher, casting the entire scene in golden light that seemed to highlight the significance of what was unfolding. The usual sounds of London traffic faded into background noise as hundreds of people found themselves drawn into this unexpected moment of human connection and respect. James Morrison stood perfectly still, but inside a storm was building. Everything he had been taught about duty, protocol, and military bearing was at war with a growing recognition that he was about to witness something that would change him forever. As the elderly veteran drew within 20 feet of James's position, the guard could finally see the man's face clearly. What he saw there nearly broke his composure entirely. The veteran's eyes held a mixture of pain, determination, and something else, a deep recognition that spoke of shared understanding between soldiers. The man's face was weathered and lined, telling the story of decades lived with both visible and invisible wounds. But his eyes were clear and focused, fixed directly on James with an intensity that seemed to see straight through the ceremonial uniform to the person underneath. This wasn't the casual gaze of a tourist taking in the sights. This was one warrior acknowledging another. James noticed that the veteran's family had stopped following him. His daughter and grandson stood back respectfully, understanding that whatever their loved one needed to do next, he needed to do it alone. Other family members had joined them, an elderly woman who was likely his wife and several younger people who might have been grandchildren or great-grandchildren. They formed a small semicircle of quiet support, their faces reflecting pride mixed with concern. The crowd around them had grown completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and had stopped their usual chatter. Hundreds of people stood watching, but the space around the veteran felt intimate, as if an invisible barrier had formed to protect this sacred encounter. Step by painful step, the veteran continued his approach. James could hear the man's breathing now, labored but steady. Each footfall echoed off the palace walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to match James's own heartbeat. The guard's training demanded absolute stillness, but every instinct as a human being was urging him to respond to this obvious display of courage and determination. The veteran finally reached the exact spot directly in front of James's position. For a moment he stood there catching his breath, the effort of the journey written clearly on his face. Then slowly and with obvious difficulty, he began to raise his functioning right arm in what James recognized as an attempt at a military salute. But the veteran's injuries made the gesture nearly impossible. His arm shook with the effort, and pain crossed his features as he struggled to complete the movement that had once been second nature to him. The partial salute wavered, imperfect but filled with more meaning than any textbook demonstration could ever achieve. James felt something crack inside his chest. This man, who had already given so much for his country, was using the last of his strength to show respect for the institution that James represented. The guard's eyes, trained to stare straight ahead, couldn't help but focus on the veteran's face. In that moment, James saw not just an elderly man struggling with physical limitations, but a reflection of everyone who had ever worn a uniform in service of something greater than themselves. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable in its intensity. The veteran's arm continued to shake as he held his incomplete salute, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement that his effort had been seen and recognized. His breathing was becoming more labored, and James could see that maintaining even this imperfect position was causing significant pain. James's mind raced through 8 years of training, through countless drills and ceremonies, through every lesson about protocol and proper behavior. He thought about his grandfather's stories from the war, about his father's pride in serving at the palace, about his own dedication to maintaining the traditions that made the Queen's Guard legendary around the world. But he also thought about what those traditions were really meant to represent: honor, service, sacrifice, and respect for those who had given everything for their country. The veteran standing before him embodied all of these values more completely than any ceremonial display ever could. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity. The veteran's salute continued to waver, his strength clearly fading but his determination unwavering. James could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, all waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. Something fundamental was shifting inside James Morrison. The rules that had governed his entire military career were being weighed against a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve. In that moment, standing face to face with a man who had paid the ultimate price for his service, James began to understand that sometimes the most important rules are the ones written in the heart, rather than in the manual. Time seemed suspended as James Morrison faced the most crucial decision of his military career. The elderly veteran's salute continued to waver before him, and James could see exhaustion beginning to overwhelm the man's determination. The guard's training screamed at him to maintain position, but something far more powerful was awakening in his heart. In a moment that would be remembered by everyone present, James made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he began to move his rifle from his side. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible as they realized what was happening. A Queen's Guard was about to break centuries of protocol. With precision born from years of military training, James brought his rifle up into the perfect position for returning a salute. His movements were crisp and purposeful, every gesture executed with the kind of flawless technique that spoke of countless hours of practice. But this wasn't practice. This was real, and everyone watching understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. The moment James's rifle reached the proper position, completing his salute to the veteran, something magical happened in the crowd. What started as surprised gasps transformed into something else entirely. One person began to clap, then another, and within seconds the entire gathering had erupted into spontaneous applause that echoed off the palace walls like thunder. The elderly veteran's face transformed completely. The pain and exhaustion that had marked his features melted away, replaced by an expression of pure joy and validation. Tears began to stream down his weathered cheeks as he realized that his gesture had been not just acknowledged, but returned with full military honors by one of the most prestigious guards in the world. James held his salute steady and strong, making sure the veteran could see that this wasn't a rushed or reluctant gesture. This was a full, proper military salute given from one soldier to another with complete respect and recognition. The guard's eyes, which should have been staring straight ahead according to protocol, were focused directly on the veteran's face, creating a connection that transcended rank, age, and regulation. The applause from the crowd grew even louder as more people understood what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a tourist attraction anymore. It had become a moment of genuine human connection and recognition. Phones and cameras were recording every second, but somehow the technology felt secondary to the raw emotion playing out before them. The veteran finally lowered his arm, his strength completely spent but his mission accomplished. James, following proper military protocol even in this unprecedented situation, held his salute for exactly the right amount of time before bringing his rifle back to his side, with the same crisp precision he had used to raise it. As James resumed his position at attention, the veteran took a step backward, then another, but instead of the exhausted shuffle that had marked his approach, there was something different in his posture now. His back seemed straighter, his head held higher. The acknowledgement he had received from the Queen's Guard had given him something precious, validation that his service had been seen and honored. The crowd's applause gradually subsided, but the energy in the courtyard remained electric. People were wiping away tears, hugging strangers and pointing excitedly as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Children who had been restless and bored moments before were now staring in wonder at James, beginning to understand that they had seen something special. The veteran's family moved forward to support him as he made his way back through the crowd, but his daughter and grandson were looking at him with new eyes. They had always known their father and grandfather was a hero, but seeing him receive this kind of recognition from such an unexpected source had given them a deeper understanding of his sacrifice and service. James Morrison stood perfectly still once again, his rifle at his side, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But inside he was experiencing a flood of emotions unlike anything he had felt before. He had broken protocol, dramatically and publicly, and he knew there would be consequences. His military career might be over, his family's proud tradition of service might end with him, and he might face discipline that would follow him for the rest of his life. But as he stood there in the aftermath of his decision, James felt something he hadn't expected: peace. He had honored something more important than rules and regulations. He had recognized a fellow soldier's service in the most meaningful way possible, and in doing so, he had discovered what true honor really meant. The morning sun continued to climb, casting new shadows across the courtyard, but something fundamental had changed in that space. Everyone present, the tourists, the veteran's family, the other guards, and even James himself, had been touched by a moment of pure human connection that transcended all barriers. Word of what had happened spread through the palace like wildfire. Within minutes, senior officers were making their way to the courtyard, their faces stern and purposeful. James could hear the crisp footsteps of his commanding officer approaching from behind, and he steeled himself for what was certain to come next. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his resolve remained steady. Colonel William Hartfield had served in the British Army for 32 years and had been responsible for maintaining discipline among the Queen's Guard for the past decade. He was known throughout the regiment as a man who valued tradition above all else, someone who believed that the rules existed for good reason and should never be broken under any circumstances. As Colonel Hartfield approached James's position, the crowd began to sense that the beautiful moment they had witnessed might be about to turn into something much less pleasant. The celebratory atmosphere started to shift toward tension as people realized the young guard might be in serious trouble for his act of compassion. Sergeant Morrison. Colonel Hartfield's voice was crisp and military precise as he stopped directly behind James. "You will accompany me immediately." The words carried the weight of official displeasure, and James felt his stomach sink. This was it, the end of his military career, possibly the end of everything he had worked toward since he was 18 years old. James executed a perfect about-face and found himself looking into Colonel Hartfield's weathered face. What he saw there wasn't quite what he had expected. Yes, there was seriousness and authority, But there was something else too, something that looked almost like curiosity, as if the colonel was trying to understand what had motivated this unprecedented breach of protocol. "Sir, I understand that I have violated regulations and I take full responsibility for my actions," James said, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "I am prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Colonel Hartfield studied him for a long moment, his gray eyes revealing nothing of what he was thinking. Behind them, James could hear the murmur of the crowd, some of whom were expressing anger at what they perceived as the military's harsh response to such a beautiful gesture. "Follow me, Sergeant," was all the colonel said, turning on his heel and walking toward the palace entrance. James fell into step behind him, his mind racing through all the possible outcomes of this situation. Court-martial, dismissal from service, the end of his family's proud military tradition. All of these possibilities seemed very real as he walked through corridors he might never see again. They entered Colonel Hartfield's office, a space filled with military memorabilia and photographs spanning decades of service. Awards and commendations lined the walls, testament to a career built on unwavering dedication to duty and protocol. James stood at attention in front of the colonel's desk, waiting for the storm he was certain would come. But Colonel Hartfield didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard where the incident had occurred. He stood there silently for several minutes, his hands clasped behind his back, apparently deep in thought. "Tell me what you were thinking, Sergeant," the colonel finally said, his voice softer than James had expected. "Help me understand why you chose to break 8 years of perfect service record for one moment with a stranger." James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words might determine the rest of his life. "Sir, that man wasn't a stranger. He was a fellow soldier who had given everything for his country. When I saw him struggling to salute, when I saw the pain he was enduring just to show respect for what I represent, I realized that honoring his sacrifice was more important than following protocol." Colonel Hartfield turned from the window, and James was surprised to see something unexpected in the older man's eyes. Understanding, perhaps even approval. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Sergeant Morrison? Do you understand the precedent you've set?" "Yes, sir. I've broken protocol and brought dishonor to the regiment. I accept full responsibility and whatever punishment you see fit." James's voice remained steady, but inside he felt hollow, knowing that his military career was over. The colonel walked around his desk and sat down, picking up a folder that James recognized as his service record. For several minutes, Colonel Hartfield read through the pages in silence, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. 8 years of exemplary service," the colonel said finally. "Numerous commendations, perfect attendance record, multiple recommendations for advancement. And then this morning you throw it all away for one moment with an elderly veteran." He looked up at James, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I understand that my actions were unacceptable, but I would make the same choice again. That man earned the right to have his salute returned." James stood straighter, accepting whatever fate awaited him. What happened next would shock James Morrison to his core and change his understanding of military leadership forever. Colonel Hartfield closed James's service record and leaned back in his chair, studying the young sergeant with intense scrutiny. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken consequences and uncertain futures. James remained at attention, prepared for the worst but hoping against hope that somehow his commanding officer might understand. "Sergeant Morrison, in my 32 years of military service, I have seen many soldiers face moments that test their character," the colonel began, his voice taking on a tone that James couldn't quite interpret. "Some pass those tests and some fail spectacularly. Today, you face such a test in front of hundreds of witnesses and television cameras that are probably broadcasting your decision around the world as we speak." James's heart sank even further. Television cameras meant that his breach of protocol wouldn't just be a military matter. It would be public knowledge, scrutinized and debated by people who had never worn a uniform or understood the weight of military tradition. Colonel Hartfield stood up and walked to a cabinet behind his desk, removing a dusty photograph in a silver frame. He set it on the desk where James could see it clearly. The black and white image showed a young soldier in World War II uniform, standing proudly beside what appeared to be a military vehicle. "This is my father, Sergeant. He served in North Africa and Italy during the war. He came home with one leg, no left eye, and nightmares that plagued him until the day he died 30 years later. The colonel's voice softened as he spoke about his father, revealing a vulnerability that James had never seen before. After the war, my father struggled to find work, struggled to fit into a society that wanted to forget about the unpleasant realities of what their freedom had cost. He told me once that the hardest part wasn't the physical injuries. It was feeling invisible, feeling like his sacrifice didn't matter to anyone anymore. Colonel Hartfield picked up the photograph, studying his father's young face. James began to understand that this conversation was taking a very different direction than he had expected. There was something in the colonel's voice that suggested he wasn't about to deliver the punishment that military protocol demanded. This morning, Sergeant Morrison, you did something that my father never experienced. You acknowledged a veteran's sacrifice in the most meaningful way possible. Soldier to soldier, warrior to warrior. You showed him that his service mattered, that it was seen and honored by the generation that followed. The colonel set the photograph down gently. But sir, James began. Confused by this unexpected turn in the conversation, I broke protocol. I violated the regulations that have governed the Queen's Guard for centuries. Surely that can't be overlooked regardless of the motivation. Colonel Hartfield walked around the desk and stood directly in front of James. Tell me, Sergeant, what do you think those regulations are really designed to protect? What is the true purpose of the Queen's Guard? James thought carefully before answering. To honor the Crown, to maintain tradition, and to serve as a symbol of British military excellence and dedication, sir. Close, the colonel said with a slight smile. But you're missing the most important element. We exist to honor and protect what Britain represents, the values and principles that generations of soldiers have died defending. Freedom, courage, honor, and respect for those who sacrifice for others. This morning, you embodied those values more perfectly than any manual or regulation ever could. The colonel returned to his desk and pulled out another folder, this one much thicker than James's service record. Do you know what this is, Sergeant? These are the letters, emails, and phone calls that have been pouring in for the past 2 hours, since video of your salute went viral on social media. Messages from veterans, from military families, from people around the world who saw what you did and recognized it for what it truly was, an act of honor and respect. James felt dizzy. He had been prepared for court-martial, for disgrace, for the end of his career. He hadn't been prepared for this. Sir, I don't understand. Are you saying that I'm not going to be disciplined for breaking protocol? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Hartfield opened the folder and began reading from one of the messages. This is from a Gold Star mother in Manchester. Thank you for showing my son's sacrifice still matters. What your guard did today reminded me why I'm proud my boy served. This one is from a veteran in Wales. I've been struggling with feeling forgotten since I returned from Afghanistan. Today, watching that guard salute that elderly veteran, I remembered that my service has meaning. The colonel looked up from the letters, his eyes bright with emotion. Sergeant Morrison, in 8 years of perfect protocol adherence, you never accomplished anything close to what you achieved in 30 seconds this morning. You reminded the world what military service really means. James felt his knees go weak with relief and disbelief. Everything he had expected, everything he had prepared himself for, was crumbling around him, but in the best possible way. However, Colonel Hartfield continued, his tone becoming more serious, we do have a problem. What you did this morning can never happen again. Because if every guard started making individual decisions about when to break protocol, chaos would follow. You understand this, don't you? James nodded solemnly, understanding the delicate balance his commanding officer was trying to maintain. Yes, sir. I understand completely. What I did cannot become a precedent that undermines military discipline and tradition. Colonel Hartfield smiled, the first genuine smile James had seen from him in all their years of service together. Good. I'm glad you understand, because what happens next is going to require wisdom and maturity from both of us. The colonel walked back to the window, gesturing for James to join him. Looking out over the courtyard, they could see that the crowd had grown even larger. News crews were setting up equipment, and people were gathering not just to see the changing of the guard ceremony, but hoping to catch a glimpse of the guard who had touched the world with his act of compassion. Sergeant Morrison, Effective immediately, you are being reassigned, Colonel Hartfield announced. James felt his heart skip a beat, wondering if this was when the punishment would finally come. You're being promoted to Staff Sergeant and transferred to our Veterans Affairs Liaison program. Your new responsibility will be coordinating ceremonies and events that honor military veterans and their families. James stared at his commanding officer in complete shock. Not only was he not being punished, he was being promoted and given a position that would allow him to continue honoring veterans in an official capacity. Sir, I don't know what to say. This is far more than I deserve, James managed to stammer. On the contrary, Sergeant Morrison, this morning you showed that you understand the true spirit of military service better than many soldiers, with twice your experience. We would be foolish not to put that understanding to good use. Colonel Hartfield extended his hand to James. Congratulations, Staff Sergeant. Your new assignment begins Monday. As they shook hands, James felt overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. What had started as the worst morning of his military career had somehow transformed into the best day of his entire life. Outside the window, the story was far from over. The video of James's salute had indeed gone viral, spreading across social media platforms and being picked up by news outlets around the world. The elderly veteran, whose name was revealed to be Harold Thompson, a 94-year-old D-Day survivor, had become an overnight symbol of courage and determination. In the days that followed, Harold Thompson received hundreds of letters and visitors from around the world. His small apartment was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from people who had been moved by his journey to honor the Queen's Guard and the Guard's decision to honor him in return. James Morrison found himself thrust into the spotlight as well, but he handled the attention with the same grace and humility he had shown in that crucial moment at the palace. In interviews, he consistently deflected praise away from himself and toward veterans like Harold Thompson, emphasizing that he had simply done what any soldier should do when faced with a fellow warrior's sacrifice. The story became more than just a viral moment on social media. It sparked a national conversation about how society treats its veterans, leading to increased funding for veteran support programs and a renewed focus on honoring military service. Schools began inviting veterans to speak to students. Communities organized recognition ceremonies, and families started sharing their own stories of military service and sacrifice. Harold Thompson lived for 3 more years after his famous visit to Buckingham Palace, and during that time he became a beloved figure who traveled to schools and community centers, sharing his experiences and encouraging young people to value service and sacrifice. He often spoke about that morning at the palace, always emphasizing how James Morrison's simple act of recognition had given him more joy and validation than any medal ever could. When Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 97, Staff Sergeant James Morrison was one of the honor guards at his funeral, standing alongside representatives from across the British military. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Harold's story and James's moment of compassion. Years later, James Morrison would rise to the rank of colonel and eventually take over the Veterans Affairs Liaison program entirely. He never forgot that morning at Buckingham Palace, and he made sure that every veteran who came through his program felt the same recognition and respect that he had shown to Harold Thompson. The story of the Royal Guard who broke protocol to honor a disabled veteran became legend, passed down through military families and veteran organizations as an example of what true honor looks like. It proved that sometimes the most important moments in life come not from following rules, but from following the deeper principles those rules were meant to protect. In a display case in James Morrison's office, alongside his many commendations and awards, sits a framed photograph from that September morning, Harold Thompson struggling to salute, and James Morrison returning that salute with perfect military precision. Below the photograph is a simple inscription: "Some rules are made to be broken when honor demands it." The image serves as a daily reminder that military service is not just about following orders or maintaining tradition. It's about recognizing the sacred bond between those who have worn the uniform and ensuring that their sacrifice is never forgotten or overlooked. Regardless of what the rule book might say,